This week on Road to the White House, our series of interviews with GOP presidential candidates continues with Texas Congressman Ron Paul. He talks about the lessons learned from his two previous presidential bids, his views on U.S. monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, abortion, and the state of the Republican Party. He also offers an assessment of the Obama administration and his strategy for winning the GOP nomination. This is 45 Minutes.
Congressman Ron Paul, this is your third presidential bid. What did you learn from the first two?
Well, the first one was in '88 in a third party, in a Libertarian Party, and I learned that our system of government isn't very conducive for any competition with the two major parties. And if you come to the conclusion that both parties are pretty close in policies, and policies never change regardless of the rhetoric, is that we don't have a real good system inviting new competition like we demand from other people around the world. So too often I don't think the democratic process is all that what it's made up to be in our country. Last go around, I learned that we were much further along in the freedom movement, defending our constitutional personal liberties, a changed foreign policy, sound money, all the things that I've been talking about, that I always assumed it would be a long time before we would get grassroots America, talking about what I've been talking about, believing that it takes a long time to change people's attitudes and intellectual approaches to government. But I think we've made tremendous progress because people do talk about the Federal Reserve now. Currently, we're talking about bringing troops home and not expanding the war. I think that's delightful. They finally are seriously talking about what are we going to do with this deficit. Of course, that motivated me to run back in the 70s, that we were on track for getting ourselves into trouble. So I think the country has moved a lot in the direction of saying, maybe our Constitution isn't all that bad. And I argue that if we follow the Constitution, our government would be much smaller and we wouldn't have the problems that we have today.
I want to touch on all of those issues, but let me follow up on the issue of a third party, because we've heard it so often from our viewers, whether it's your bid in 1988, Ross Perot in 1992, or more recent third-party presidential bids. Why is it so difficult for third parties to break through, and what do you think our founding fathers would think about the system we have today?
They wouldn't be too pleased with it because it cuts out so many people. Now, Ross Perot did pretty well, but he had a lot of money. And the problem with somebody who just has an average amount of money, they're generally excluded. I did it in '88, but I didn't get into debates, even though I got on enough ballots to theoretically could win. But you're not given credibility. So it's a perception, and frequently it is the media that helps keep the third party, alternative parties out of the discussion. The other thing is the two parties run all state laws, and the laws are very biased against getting on the ballots. In '88, I had to spend more than half my money just trying to get on the ballot. So it isn't, some states much easier than others. Some states you get 50 signatures, you can get on. Others you might need 25,000 signatures. So it's very difficult. But those rules are really designed not to allow competition, with the major parties. New York, matter of fact, I think is a good state because they encourage people to file on two parties. Like you can file as a Republican and a conservative, or Democrat and a liberal party, and then you can add them up. And that gives a little bit of credibility to that. So if you could do that in other states, I think it would be very helpful and help get more attention for these alternative choices.
Are you in this race to win the nomination, or are you in to send a message?
No, I'm in to win it. And when I first started in Congress, people would ask me the same thing. I'm in to win it. But even when I ran originally, I thought, well, how can I convince a whole congressional district, of the problems that we face when they were less interested, back in the 70s. So I actually was a bit surprised that I did so well, and I think it's 12 times I've won a congressional seat, always saying the same thing and arguing the case for strictly limited government. So that is the same way now. So the goal is to win the election.
Born and raised in Pittsburgh, and yet you represent a South Texas congressional district. Walk us through the 1960s as you graduated from college, went to medical school, became an Air Force medical surgeon, and then ended up in Texas.
Yes, I went to Duke Medical School, and then I started my residency at the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. It was there when I received a draft notice, and the draft notice said that I'd be drafted as a buck private in the Army unless I wanted to volunteer. Then I could be a doctor, and I could pick the service that I wanted to be in. So I always kid. I said I immediately volunteered. So I volunteered under the pressure of being drafted outright into the Army, and I of course got to practice medicine. So I got into the Air Force, became a flight surgeon, actually stayed in longer than I had thought, because my obligation was 2 years, and with my reserve duty I actually stayed for 5 years. But I was stationed in San Antonio, Texas, and then I finished my medical training in the University of Pittsburgh. But my wife and I decided that Texas was a nice place, and she liked the warmer climate. So then we moved. There was a medical practice available not too from Houston. So we took that opportunity and moved down to a little town called Lake Jackson, Texas.
Why did you decide to become a doctor?
It's interesting. I think for many years I wanted to be, but I wouldn't admit it, because you don't like to fail. I'm in high school and college, I'm going to be a doctor. I never said that and didn't know it, because I wanted to make sure I could do it. But I just had respect for physicians, and I thought it was just really wonderful that you could do something like what I got to do for many years, deliver babies. This to me was fascinating, and also being able to do surgery. The whole thing is there was one other element that influenced me, because I'm old enough to remember World War II and Korea. One of our teachers was drafted and went to Korea and then was killed over there, and war had a big impact on me. And I often thought, well, you know what? I don't think I could shoot anybody. So I thought, I'll probably get drafted someday. So I think I would much rather take care of people and be in the medical corps than I'd have to be in the infantry, because it just seems so abhorrent to me. So I think it was my nature that I became anti-war, wanted to be a physician, and actually it's probably not just a coincidence that I ended up delivering babies, which is a wonderful part of medicine.
And if you could explain the transition between being a doctor and being a politician.
Never thought of it as much as a transition, because I still think of myself, I'm a physician that happens to have been in Washington. But the transition occurred through an interest that I developed in the 1960s as I was finishing medical school and in my medical training, and that was a fascination with trying to understand economics from a viewpoint that I discovered, which was called the Austrian School of Economics, which is different than Keynesian. It's almost opposite of Keynesian or socialism. The extreme opposite of Austrian free markets would be total socialism. Keynesianism is somewhere in the middle. And most of it's been taught, as I was, Keynesian, you need government to do this, you need to regulate, you need to print the money, and all these many things that we have done that I thought was so harmful. So I became totally convinced that they were on the right track. And when their prediction came true that the Bretton Woods monetary system broke down, that was on August 15th, 1971, which I remember the day precisely because it was dramatic, and it ushered in a new age. A new age was governments can spend endlessly and they can print the money when they need it, and I predicted that would lead to a lot of trouble. So I started talking about economics just to get it off my chest. And of course my wife was worried, why do you want to do that? You have a wonderful medical practice. And she says, it's dangerous. You could end up getting elected if you do this. But I assured her that wasn't possible, because I was going to take this position, which was a strong philosophic position and a stickler for the Constitution. But she had predicted, no, you'll probably be very successful because people will want to hear the truth of the matters that we're dealing with. So that's how I got involved. It was more or less a way to get things off my chest and talk about the policies that we should have. And I wasn't teaching economics, but it worked out because I could continue to practice medicine, and I did up until coming into Congress Congress here this last time, I was actually doing some teaching for the first couple years I came back. I came back in '97. So 2 or 3 years, I had a daughter that was studying OBGYN at the University of Texas in Houston. So I was teaching in a clinic there. But after that, it got too busy. So I still, think I am basically a physician that sort of accidentally got into politics.
Let me ask you about the Federal Reserve, because you are a fierce critic of the Fed. What is your argument against the Fed, and what do you want to see changed?
Well, I ultimately think we should get rid of it. And I'm a critic because it is economic planning. Most conservatives, understand central economic planning, wage and price controls. These are all just anathema to a conservative. And yet, that's what the central bank is, a central economic planner. Their job is to maintain stable prices and full employment. Prices aren't stable and there's no full employment, so they've done a lousy job because they're incapable of knowing what the best interest rate is. They're incapable of knowing what the money supply should be. They're incapable of knowing how to manipulate the economy so there's full employment. And everything they do depends on creation of money, which creates the devaluation of the currency. So they're at fault. They create the bubbles, therefore they create the recessions and the depressions. And they're way too much involved. We do not have the authority to have a central bank. Hamilton and Jefferson fought over that, and Hamilton wanted a central bank, and they did have national banks in our early history, and Jefferson got rid of one and Jackson got rid of the other one. So we really lived most of the time up until 1913 without a central bank. But devaluation of currency should be considered a crime, but that's a deliberate policy. The Fed came into existence in 1913. A dollar was defined as 1/20th of an ounce of gold, $20 to 1 ounce. Today it's over $1,500. That means the currency has been devalued 98%, and people lose on that. People are cheated. If you're a saver, if you save $10,000 and it's devalued 50%, you get $10,000 back, but it only buys $5,000. So it's the way you cheat people. Characteristically, when you destroy a currency, you transfer wealth out of the middle class to the wealthy. And we're witnessing that all the time today. When the bailouts come, they bail out the wealthy. Yes, they had to pay higher prices for gasoline, but it doesn't hurt them. The person now who's lost their job because of the recession, they didn't get the bailout, and now they're getting hit with higher cost of living. So it's a terrible system, and it's built on a mystical belief that if you just print money, it's going to have value. It's never worked. It works for a while, and our total fiat currency has been since 1971, and it's worked relatively well, but all it did was it taught us to borrow money and spend beyond our means, finance a empire that we shouldn't have and can't afford, and we have pretended that we could finance forever our entitlement system. And now we know that Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, they're all broke. But that's all a consequence of not understanding the monetary system.
Let me ask you about the issue of bailouts, because Hank Paulson, who served in the Bush administration, as you know, saying that the bailouts of the Wall Street banks saved us from the abyss of economic collapse. The Obama administration argues that it's bailout of Chrysler and GM, saving jobs in Detroit. What's your argument against those bailouts? Let me ask you about the issue of bailouts, because Hank Paulson, who served in the Bush administration, as you know, saying that the bailouts of the Wall Street banks saved us from the abyss of economic collapse. The Obama administration argues that it's bailout of Chrysler and GM, saving jobs in Detroit. What's your argument against those bailouts?
Well, in a way, they're right, but at whose expense? At the expense of the people who lost their houses and lost their jobs and are suffering. Yes, they saved the depression and harm and some suffering on Wall Street, but they needed to go bankrupt. The companies that were broke, they should go into bankruptcy, and the good assets bought up instead of dumped on the taxpayers. So these banks and all that were making money off these derivatives, we ended up owning those because they're in they've been bought up by the Federal Reserve to the tune of trillions of dollars, which again diluted the value of the money. They created the money out of thin air. So they're right. Wall Street, the big banks, and some of these corporations would have had a tougher time, but they never got hurt. They were saved. And for instance, the car companies, they protected, the labor funds more than the regular investors. So the people who had invested in the companies lost everything, but because the way the administration designed it, the bonds held by the labor unions, they were protected. So it's always special interests. Either big labor or big corporations benefit to the expense of the average person who is still suffering. And even today, on the statistics and what we're reading and hearing about, the economy keeps getting weaker, and they act like they're surprised. But if they admit that we got in this trouble by spending too much and borrowing too much and taxing too much and printing too much, how can we get out of it by doing exactly the same? They said, well, interest rates were held too low too long, and that's why Greenspan got us into this trouble. So what are they doing? Lowering them even further to actually minus now. It's negative interest rates because we're practically zero and inflation's at 4 or 5%. So it's negative interest rates. And they think that's the solution. It isn't the solution. It perpetuates the problem. That's why the predictions, once again by Austrian economists 3 years ago, said, what you're doing is wrong. You're going to prolong the agony. Now we're into it 3 years, going on 4 years. And the economy is actually getting weaker. So we're working on trying to compete with the depression of the 1930s the way we're operating right now.
So what is your current assessment of Ben Bernanke? What kind of a job is he doing?
Well, I guess from their viewpoint, if you're a money manager, I mean, he probably manages the money like all other central bankers would. But from somebody who believes that nobody can do it, he's just an average central banker, and they manipulate, but he's a lot more determined than some. I would say that his approach and determination to inflate regardless, they even kid about him. He says, if you need to, we'll drop the money out of the helicopters if necessary. Just inflate, inflate, inflate. Compared to Paul Volcker, in 1979, we had high inflation rates, and he said, we have to save the dollar and we have to save the economy. He took interest rates up to 20%. So he was one that was forced to restrain. So his approach was different. But I try very hard, even though I end up doing it, criticizing the very central bankers. I criticize the system more than anything because they're trying to manage an unmanageable system, and the flaw is that they trust that system, and they're not capable of doing it. They just don't have the information. Only the market knows what the interest rates should be, because if they lower the interest rates for the banks and they benefit, if you have somebody that's elderly and trying to save money, the market rate of a CD should be maybe 6 or 7%. They get 1 or 2%. So they get cheated. So it's a very unfair system, and there's no way, no matter how well intended they are, and basically I'm sure they're well intended, they can't manage it because it's a deeply flawed system.
So should we go back to the gold standard?
I don't use those words, but the Constitution says we can have only gold and silver as legal tender, and that hasn't been repealed. Much of what I have written about, like and the Fed, the book I wrote on and the Fed, I don't think we need that, but I always say that the transition should be more gradual. So I'm not for closing the Fed down as much as allowing competition, legalizing the competition in the currencies, and that is to allow people to use gold and silver and legalize the Constitution. And then if the Fed fails, as I suspect they will, there will be a currency in place. But there were flaws in the gold standard in the 19th century, and we can learn from it. So I like to think about going forward to a commodity standard of money with competition, and this is something that Hayek taught, and he was one of the Austrian economists.
Liberty Defined is your latest book. How many have you written, by the way?
Well, I guess it depends on how you count them. There were a lot of little pamphlets that I've written. I would say books of that size, maybe 5.
So you write about 50 essential freedoms. Take 1 or 2 from this book that you think are essential for the U.S.
Well, personal liberty, and I talk about that a lot. Not repealing the Fourth Amendment, not allowing the Patriot Act out of this sense of insecurity to give up on our personal privacy. So I talk a lot about that. To protect liberties, you have to keep the government small, and one of the greatest incentives for the growth of government is a military operation. When we are constantly at war, government gets bigger and people are more likely to sacrifice their liberties. And I also talk a whole lot about the monetary issue as well. And it's the rejection. I recognize, when you talk about liberty, I recognize our life and liberty come to us in a natural way and not from our government. But what we have to do in order to preserve that is we have to reject any personal or governmental use of force. You know, government can't come in and, from our viewpoint, and use force because we think we know how to make you behave better, or we think you know how we should teach you how to raise your children, or something like that. So you never use force. Individuals can't use force. Governments can't use force. In our day and age, we still recognize that people can't hurt other people and you can't steal from other people, but we say the government can redistribute wealth and it's perfectly okay. Well, he needs something, and so it invites this entitlement system, and that becomes you know, what people believe is freedom. They have a right to entitlements, and that's completely wrong, because if you believe in a free society, it's the opposite: no coercion, and we wouldn't use coercion to tell other countries what to do. And we're always telling other countries what to do, and if they don't do what we say, we bomb them. So that's the kind of thing that we'd like to stop.
You've said in the past that you don't like labels, but you've been described as a libertarian, as a Republican, as a conservative. How would you describe yourself? You've said in the past that you don't like labels, but you've been described as a libertarian, as a Republican, as a conservative. How would you describe yourself?
Well, when people would bring that up and use one of those terms, I probably would have no objection. I am a Republican. I'm conservative, very conservative in my social beliefs, so I want to conserve the basic thrust of our Constitution, you know, to that. But the founders were very libertarian. I mean, the way the Constitution is written is the government doesn't have much authority. It's written to restrain the federal government. That's basically why we have a Constitution. So that's a very libertarian idea. The founders didn't believe in interfering in the internal affairs of other nations. They believed in free trade. So that's very libertarian. If somebody just say, what is the word that you would use, I'd probably say a constitutionalist, in this, because that's the oath of office I take. I mean, there are some things in the Constitution I'd write differently, and we have the right to amend the Constitution, so it doesn't mean that you're absolutely overly rigid in anything, but you do take an oath to obey it, which means that if you want to change it, you should do it not by ignoring it or not allowing the courts to do it or not allowing the executive branch, like we allow the executive branch to go to war improperly. So if we do that, we should change the Constitution. We have a Department of Education, and nobody ever said, well, where do you get this authority in the Constitution? Well, you don't. Well, if the country wants a Department of Education, they should give this authority in the Constitution. So I call myself a strict constitutionalist, but I'd be open to you know, clarifying some of the provisions in the Constitution, because people have overstepped their bounds and they've misinterpreted much of what is written in the document.
So let's take a couple of issues. First of all, abortion. What's your view?
I'm pro-life. I think once the fetus is there, it's human and it's alive and it has legal rights, inheritance rights. If somebody injures a woman and that fetus is aborted, it's a homicide. So I think it's a life. It is a life, biologically and legally. It's a life. And government is very limited, but it should protect life. And to deliberately take that life is an act of aggression, but I don't believe it's the role of the federal government to be involved, because you know, other things, I mean, there's all kinds of acts of violence. It's always held at the state level, and every state does it slightly differently. You know, you have first and second degree murder and homicides, and there's 4 or 5 different categories that you can put in, but the states sort this out, and courts sort it out, and juries sort it out. So I do not advocate a federal approach to dealing with a very tough problem, and that's the uniqueness and the greatness of our country, is sometimes states will do it differently. But when the courts do it nationally and monolithically and apply to all the states like they did with Roe versus Wade, see, I object to that, because they shouldn't even have been dealing with that. Texas had a law, and they were doing it, and they had a right to do it. It might not have been perfect, but how can the courts come in and strike one law and rewrite the laws for the whole country? That was the founders would be very, very bewildered by how we allowed our courts to legislate as they do.
So in your years as a doctor, as an OBGYN, have you ever had to counsel a woman who was thinking about having an abortion?
Oh, many, many times. And when I was in practice first, the subject rarely came up. I came to Congress for 4 terms, then I went back to practice. But that was in the late 70s, early 80s. But by the time I went back, culturally, things had changed. Abortions were done routinely. And it bewildered me because young women would come in and I said, you are pregnant. It asked, they'd ask for an abortion like they were asking for a penicillin shot. You know, they didn't know what was going on. So I did my best to counsel them, and it was after I went back in 1984 that the ultrasound became more prevalent. So I got an ultrasound, and it's a great medical instrument, and yet the ultrasound serves a purpose to show a young woman, anybody, you know, what is there in the first or second or third week even, you know, and then a lot of them would have second thoughts. In the 1960s, Bernard Nathanson, who got the laws all changed, he was doing abortions illegally and had a clinic where they did 65,000 abortions until he got an ultrasound and he became pro-life. He says, you know, even though he was an OBGYN doctor, he started seeing the heartbeat and the fingers and the toes and the sucking the fingers at an early age, that all of a sudden he says he couldn't do them anymore. During that period of time, actually he was an atheist, and then he converted to Christianity and became part of the Right to Life group. He's passed away recently, but he's an interesting person because he was such a strong supporter of abortion, but the ultrasound changed it. So I think that was part of what was happening in my medical practice. When you show somebody actually what is there, they might have second thoughts.
A couple of other issues. Foreign policy. Is there a Ron Paul doctrine when it comes to U.S. foreign policy?
I don't think I'd call it a Ron Paul doctrine, but I'd call it an American doctrine that has been our tradition and was advised to us by our founders, and which is granted to us by our Constitution. We have no authority to go in and nation build. We have no authority to get involved in internal affairs of other nations. We have authority to have a strong national defense. But I would say there has been nothing that we have done militarily since 1945 that had essentially anything to do with defending this country. Matter of fact, it has made our defense a lot worse, and it's bankrupted our country. But that's, I think that's part of what our traditions were, and the founders' strong advice: stay out of these entangling alliances. Even as recently as the year 2000, George Bush ran on a humble foreign policy and no nation building. But what happened? You know, we're still into it. Then Obama was the peace candidate, you know, this last go around. So the first thing he did was send a lot of troops to Afghanistan, and now he's wondering when is he going to bring them back, and I'll bring a couple back this week and a couple next week. So the foreign policy that I advocate, I call it a pro-American constitutional foreign policy.
Finish the sentence. The state of the country today is
in dire straits because there's a very poor understanding and determination that people really want to be free and assume responsibility for themselves, and they think that government too often can take care of them. And yet we're in the transition. We're in a transition where people realize government is failing. Even those who are on the receiving end realize that these entitlements might not come forever. So we're in the middle of this transition, and I think that's very healthy, and I think we're making progress.
How do we bring back the jobs? How do we jumpstart the economy?
You have to do the things that, and we have to understand what caused it. If you don't understand that, all this other stuff is mischief. And we got into this trouble by too much spending, and especially by the distortions caused by easy credit, low interest rates, sending the wrong messages, malinvestment, too much debt. So you have to eliminate that. You have to have the correction. You have to liquidate the debt. You've got to eliminate bad investments. And that means a hands-off attitude and get rid of it. 1921 we did that. It was not a depression except for 1 year. In the 30s, we refused to keep our hands off. It lasted for 15 years, and right now we're doing the same thing. So if you want jobs back, you got to get the taxes down, the spending down, and deregulate, not keep. Every time we get in a crisis, we add more regulations. Both Republicans and Democrats said, well, we're in this problem because there should have been more regulations, and then there wouldn't have been a housing bubble. But the regulation should have been on the Federal Reserve. That's where the regulation should have been. So, but if you just accept free market principles and provided freedom to the people and right to keep what they earn, even if we lost everything we had today, I think within a year we'd be very wealthy again. And the younger generation that I talk to understand this because all they see is a burden of financing these wars. They can't get jobs, and how are they going to pay for these people who are receiving on the entitlement? So I think I just understand how a free society works, because the freer the society, the more prosperous it is.
Based on our viewers, and anytime we talk politics, your name more often than not comes up, and you have become, in some circles, a cult figure in American politics. Do you view yourself as that?
No, I'd worry a little bit about using that term because I think I explained very clearly that what is important are ideas, and right now the Tea Party movement has a lot to deal with changing attitudes in Washington. I think the reason they're starting to talk about troops coming home is there's enough people saying that they're tired of it. So I think it's ideas that move the world in many ways. I challenge the whole concept of Keynesian economics and try to get people to study free market economics. But I don't think I'd ever want to use the word cultish or cult.
Why did the Tea Party begin? What are its roots, and what role did you play?
Well, see, indirectly I played a role, but not directly. I didn't say, oh, you know, let's have a Tea Party movement. We had a campaign going on in 07, and on the anniversary of the original Tea Party, I think it was December 16th, and the grassroots, the supporters I had, say, well, let's celebrate the Boston Tea Party by having these events all around the country. And that was the day they broke all records and raised $6 million, and they did. The campaign did it sort of spontaneously, but it was done on the celebration of the Boston Tea Party. So that was sort of the breakout on that, and then it morphed into something much bigger, and it became much broader, and there were other people that joined that didn't have exactly the same views, but mostly they came together because government was too big and they were worried about the deficit.
What's it like to have a son in the U.S. Senate?
Well, I think it's pretty fascinating. You know, Rand had always been very interested in politics, always helped me in many campaigns. Of course, also he's a physician. But I think it's pretty fascinating, and it makes my wife and I very proud.
It's the first time in history that the son has been in the Senate, the father in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, you say that like that's a challenge, and somebody else did that the day we were being sworn in. They said, yeah, how do you feel that your son's in the Senate, you know? And I said, well, I've explained it to him that if he is in the Senate and does a very, very good job, someday he might even get to serve in the House of Representatives.
When did you first meet your wife?
In high school. And matter of fact, I think the first date we had was she was born on leap year, you know, on February 29th. So I only have to buy presents, you know, every 4 years, which she doesn't let me get away with, but I pretend. The first date was when she was 16.
If there is someone in American history that you would like to sit down and have a conversation with, who would that be?
Boy.
If there is someone in American history that you would like to sit down and have a conversation with, who would that be?
Boy, I guess there'd be several. In American history, a lot of times I think in economic terms. I'd like to pick the brain of these people who I think were very smart on economics. But you know, there's a couple when it comes to presidents. I think it'd be neat to talk to Jefferson, but I'd also like to talk to Grover Cleveland, because Grover Cleveland, you know, was sort of the last of the true constitutionalists and hard money person, and didn't like foreign adventurism. although a Democrat. But I think he'd be a fascinating. He believed in vetoing bills when he didn't like them.
Why does Ron Paul want to be president?
I think I can offer something different than the others have offered, and it hasn't been offered in a long time, and we desperately need, a restoration of a belief and conviction that freedom is more important. And ironically, most people want to be president because I know how to manage foreign policy, and I know what is best for you, and they set the rules for you, and I know how to run the economy. But ironically, I don't want to do any of those things. I think I could do a great job by diminishing the authoritarianism of the president and getting rid of the idea of the president being moved in the direction of a dictator. So I don't want to police the world. I want to defend this country. I don't want to tell you how to live your life. I just want to protect you from people who might hurt you, where the violence, prevent the violence. And no individual can run the economy. So, but you need a free economy. You need to understand that. So my desire to be president is to set the course of this country in a different direction. And it was once on that direction. That's when we were more free, more prosperous, and we were the lender. And now we're the borrower. We're the biggest borrower in the history of the world. We owe about $3 trillion. So I'd like to change all that. And fortunately for that goal, we have a good precedent. It's not like I've invented something new. It's not like I said, let's have the Ron Paul movement. It's nothing like that. It's saying, why don't we pick up on and refine and even improve on what we had in the past? Because freedom is a young idea. It's been just tested just a few hundred years. And we need to continue to do that. Just like I said earlier, the gold standard can be a better gold standard. You don't want to always go back, but we need to improve it. But right now, we have slipped. We've lost our confidence. We do not have enough confidence in ourselves. We believe that we have to give up liberty in order to be safe and secure, whether it's economically or physically safe and secure, and that is why we're less free.
So let's turn to politics in the campaign. How do you get the nomination? What's your strategy?
My strategy is just to keep doing the same thing I've been doing for so long and talking about the issues. And then campaign, organizations also have people that work very hard in locating and identifying, getting people to the polls and understanding the laws and the rules, the difference between a state like New Hampshire and Iowa, a caucus state versus a primary state, and which ones come first. And that is very, very important, but that's, especially for me, is usually left to other people who are interested in managing and working in a campaign. But it's getting the votes. And I hope that I'm the one that can provide a policy for them, which will excite people not only to work hard, but send the money as well.
So size up the field, your opponents right now, beginning with Mitt Romney.
Well, I can't do that individually because I put them all in one lump. Because I think they represent mostly the status quo, so I see them as a group with variations. Mitt Romney is going to be different than Michelle, Bachmann, but they still, the whole group want to promote in many ways the status quo. They're not calling for all the troops to come home. They're not calling for a new monetary system. They're not calling for, the repeal of all laws that the executive branch writes. I want a significant change and a restoration of these freedom principles. So although they may vary one to the other, they're really just a variation of the status quo, because they just see that and my supporters are seeking too much at one time. But they're moving in that direction, which I find interesting.
So what does that tell you about the Republican Party?
About my comments about the candidates? Well, I think the Republican Party has not been real strong, because I think Richard Nixon said it the best. He says, we're all Keynesians now, that we all believe in this stuff, and we believe in big government, and we believe in welfare and all this. So no, the parties have been very, very much the same over these years. Republicans will talk about free markets, but they're big regulators. I mean, Sarbanes-Oxley was a reaction to Enron. They're big governments overseas. They're big regulators here at home. They wanted the bailouts, and so that can't go. I mean, this last decade, the Republicans ran up a lot of debt. So that's why that status quo attitude that engulfs both the Republicans and the Democrats have to change if we really want to preserve our liberties and have our prosperity once again.
So based on your comments, if Michelle Bachmann or John Huntsman or Mitt Romney becomes the Republican nominee, would you support them? Would you run as a third party?
I think it depends. I couldn't support McCain last time because I thought the foreign policy was so bad. Of course, he still has the same foreign policy. So if the candidate endorses a foreign policy like that, I could not support him.
Would you run as a third party?
I'm not even thinking about that.
And conversely, if you do become the Republican nominee, how do you win the general election, and what's your message against the president, Barack Obama?
Actually, the general election might be even easier than the primary because you know, the Republican primary voters tend to be more likely to endorse war, and I'm against the wars. But that doesn't mean we're not making progress. And sometimes personal liberty and some of the primary voters consider this license, and people shouldn't be allowed to make up their own minds. So the independents is where I get strong support. So we have a lot of independents coming into the Republican Party, you know, to help out in our campaign. And a lot of liberal Democrats are very unhappy with Obama, his foreign policy. They thought he was going to be much more of a peace candidate, and he isn't, so they're turned off. And also, he has not been any good at all in civil liberties. I mean, he was anxious to, you know, make the Patriot Act permanent. You know, he's not backing off on privacy issues at all. I mean, I want to restore the Fourth Amendment. I want people not to be able to get into your computer or your telephone or any of your records without a search warrant. That's what the law of the land says. But so a lot of Democrats are unhappy with that. So I think in the general, it would be a lot easier task than in getting enough people, you know, converted in the Republican Party. But being right to life and conservative socially and arguing the states' rights position and the growing interest and the concern about all this spending overseas on foreign policy, I think that's why we're doing so much better in Republican primaries right now.
So how would you personally assess the president's performance? Do you want to give him a grade? Do you want to give him a review? What would you say about his leadership so far?
He's just average. He's just like the presidents have been for so many decades, just, you know, plodding along and not changing anything. Economic policy stays the same, keep spending more money, deficits get bigger, keep pursuing wars and flaunting the Constitution, the Congress by going to war without even asking it. So no, it's just plodding along. So he gets a poor grade, but I can't remember. It's been a long time since we've had a president. Like I said, you know, Grover Cleveland was a great president, but in recent decades, we haven't had anybody shrink the size of government. I want to be the first president that ever made the Federal Register smaller. You know, we don't. It depends on the size of the print, but there's like 60 or 70,000 pages, and they add every single day. But the executive branch is not even allowed to write law, and that's what they're doing. All these regulations are law. So I want to repeal those things. I want to shrink this. That will invite businesses maybe back into this country because they don't face the same complication. In a country like China, they're more conducive for business. China right now is our banker. They loan us money, and they're investing in places like Afghanistan and you know, investing in minerals and other things. We're over there fighting and killing each other and spending money and bankrupting our country. So we need to change that. We need to get back to investing that money here.
Two final points. Are you optimistic about the future of America, or are you concerned?
I'm very concerned, especially on the short run. I'm pretty optimistic on the long run, mainly because I spend a lot of time with the current young generation. And they're very, very concerned about what's happening, but they're very optimistic that we have answers to it. They're very much into looking at the Federal Reserve and doing the things necessary. And the young people that support me understand the need to assume responsibility for themselves. But that doesn't, I mean, the transition is what's rough. And if it gets, look at what's going on in Greece. There's nothing that guarantees that we won't have those riots on our streets when our dollar starts, you know, really going down and prices going up, and there's no money in the bank. There's still a lot of people in this country that believe they have a right. The government must take care of me. So that could be very, very dangerous. And like on the monetary issue, there's most of the people understand where the dollar will not be maintained as the reserve currency. But already the IMF and the World Bank are trying to grab hold and issue the world currency. And that's exactly opposite of what I'd like to do.
And finally, often when you run for office, and you've run for the House, you've run for the Senate, you've run for the President 3 times, you learn a lot about yourself. Have you learned a lot about who you are during this process?
Well, hopefully so. What I work on is trying to make what some people think are difficult issues to understand, like economic policy, make it as simplistic as possible so people can understand it, but most importantly, making these views palatable, that it's in their best interest. Because if I say, I'm going to cut you off from all your welfare program, oh, you're going to destroy my life. But if you realize what's coming, you're going to lose it anyway. I want people to understand that it's in their best interest. So I would say that's what I've worked on, and I've learned a bit to try to explain to people why it's in their best interest. Because if they don't think a free society is in their best interest, they will choose to be slaves. And we've been moving in that direction. They've been enslaving themselves. Government will take care of me. And we had such great wealth, and they were able to do that. But now the wealth is dissipated, the jobs are gone, the debt is rising, and we're on autopilot on the spending. So that's why this is a wonderful opportunity for the freedom message to get out and for people to accept it.
And what does your wife and family think about this?
About
your race for the White House?
Oh, actually, they probably encouraged me more than I expected, or maybe I needed, you know. No, they've been very, very encouraging. My wife has always encouraged me to do it.
Congressman Ron Paul, thank you very much for being with us here on C-SPAN.
Good to be with you.
Appreciate it.